I think that that's going to work better, and instead I'm going to post some additional materials that I think are useful. I tried to post some of those as well. I posted, I'm going to take you over here to my copy here. Let's see if this will work. Here I'm now showing you the my screen of Google Classroom, and I hope you're all. Are you all seeing that? Tell me if you're seeing that. Okay, good. So you're all seeing that. And so a couple of things I just want to point out. In lieu of me talking for 2 hours twice, I've offered some things that I think are helpful, some of which I actually have used in my classrooms before. One that I think is super helpful is right here. It's a video. It's actually, I believe, a History Channel, like back when History Channel actually had history in it. And it's a really pretty decent documentary that just tells about who all the gods and goddesses are in Greek mythology. There are so many. Welcome, Marianne. There's so many, it's hard to keep up with them. And the Odyssey only deals with really a few. Mostly we're going to spend a lot of time with Athena. And Athena is a very powerful goddess. We'll talk about her in a moment. But that I think is super helpful just to get an idea of who they all are. There is no such thing as a Bible for Greek mythology. And so the closest thing we have in some ways are the texts like the Iliad, like the Odyssey, that tell us a little bit about they tell us a little bit about who they are. But there's nothing that has the authoritative view like we would have in a Bible. So we just glean from the different stories. And this one deals heavily with Athena. We get some of the other gods in there. We'll get a little bit of Zeus. We'll certainly get, not Neptune, but Poseidon. In the Roman mythology, his name is Neptune, but Poseidon, who's very angry with Odysseus. He's the primary reason that Odysseus can't go home. So we'll meet some of them, but this kind of gives you all of them. If you love that kind of thing like I do, I think you'll find that interesting. I also included 4 other sources here. I'll show you. I'm going to pull it up again on my Google Classroom. You have it as well. But right here, there are 4 resources that I like. One is back in 1997, they made a made-for-TV film of the Odyssey, and it's about as cheesy as could possibly be. However, if you're struggling with the Odyssey, I guarantee you watch that, and it's a mini series. It's a full 3 hours long. Then reading it will be a little easier. They're not super true to the text, but they do give you a pretty good idea. And I agree, Mark, that the Achilles was great, especially the part when he's dead and you can still see him breathing. I love that. But the guy who plays Odysseus does a nice job. The gods and goddesses are a little silly, but still kind of fun. I've given you a link to the beginning of a YouTube where Ian McKellen reads the translation that I've asked you to read. Some of you have already told me that you watched the animated kind of 47-minute version of the Odyssey. That's kind of a quick and dirty version for kids, but still gives you kind of an overview. And I'm a big fan of Crash Course, and this one gives you just a quick 12-minute Cliff Notes talk about the Odyssey. I think you'll fall in love with him and Crash Course. You may want to watch some of the other things if you're a history major. Lots of things on history. So those are some things I've put up as well. One other thing I'd like to point out, you have a paper due in 1 week. 1 week from today. Your first paper is due on Monday, May 22. And I'm asking you to do it in Google Docs. Now, some of you, how many of you have ever worked in Google Docs before? Okay, good. Quite a few. Even if you haven't, it's super easy. And it looks like some of you know it very, very well. I would like you to do your paper in Google Docs, upload it. That way I can also see it. I can make comments. If you start working on it now and want me to kind of take a look at it, I can make suggestions. I know, Stacy, you were asking if I could look at it in advance. This is a great way to do that. This also is how I will do my grading. I will grade directly onto your document, so that way we don't need paper. And I think that this is going to work nicely. So the important thing, if you've not used it before, when you click on the link there for paper number 1, literary autobiography, you'll be given 2 options. One is to add and the other is to create. You want to, and this is important, to create a document. And so just click on that create drop-down menu and create a document. It'll automatically name your document for you, and that will become your paper. I'm just curious, just on the chat, how many of you have already begun to, well, let me ask, how many have actually already begun to work on the paper? Anyone? All right, most know, a few maybe started. So, okay, so about half and half from what I'm seeing. How about, how many of you at least have an idea of what you will do? Do you have an idea? Okay, some yes, some no. I'm hoping that something will inspire you, perhaps in our discussion of the monomyth, perhaps in our discussion of Genesis, and perhaps now as we enter the Greeks, maybe something will inspire you to do a paper. This is a literary autobiography. It's kind of a glorified reaction paper. I want you to think a little bit about how, think about that idea that myths actually create the culture we live in. How we read the Bible and those stories has created the culture that we live in right now. I would go so far as to say those stories invented us. And how we interpret them often is invented by the culture itself. And so it's going to be, it kind of goes both ways. And I'm just asking you to look at that in your own culture, your own life, your own personal life, and how you might be affected in some way. Josh is asking how long it's supposed to be. And I've attached a PDF there that you can go to that gives all of the requirements on there. I generally don't like to give a word count or something like that, but I'm thinking you could probably do this in about somewhere around 500 to 750 words. Please don't feel like that's an actual word count. Nothing gets me more excited than when somebody quotes from some of the texts we've used, or even other texts that you come across, because you're certainly more aware now of the mythologies that have been a part of our lives now. So, and all of those words, if you're just trying to make it longer, that's a great way to do it, although I hate that. I think one of the things, maybe that's why they call it a BS degree, is that we're all really good at writing a 100-word essay in 500 words. We've gotten very good at that. We look, see how many words, and then we add fluff. I've been teaching writing for a long time. I recognize fluff. There, am I back in focus? Sorry, I got out of focus there for a second. And anyway, I think I want you to make it a fun project, one that's thoughtful, one that incorporates something that we've either discussed, read. Those are the kinds of things that excite me And if you're looking for a way to do that, grading is a very subjective thing. But those are some things that you can do that will make for a stronger paper, a stronger argument. And I do care about grammar and mechanics and things like that. So, and if you're not strong at that, I'm okay if you want to have someone take a look at it. I don't want anyone to write your paper for you, and I just think that that would be useful. Does that help a little bit for the paper that's due in a week? Anyone give me, okay, good. I'm getting lots of yeses. I'm also, another reason I was asking how many are on campus is I'm giving this talk right now from Michelle's office, and until I get internet at my house, because my internet isn't working in my house for some reason, at least I'm not well, I'm giving these things from my wife's office, which is on the second floor of the Dick building, which means if you're on campus, I'm easy to find at least twice a week. You can come. I'm always here a little early preparing, or you could run over after class and talk to me. And I've given you my number. You can text me questions. So please feel free. If you have any questions, please do so. I want to jump, if I may, into the discussion of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I'm going to jump right into my PowerPoint here, because this way you get to look at that rather than look at me. And I haven't asked you to read the Iliad. I'm asking you to read the Odyssey. That's largely because of these two great epic poems that many believe was written by the same person that we call Homer. But the Odyssey is the easier to read, and since we're in a condensed format, that seems like it'll be a better read. But it has the disadvantage of being a sequel. So I want to talk a little bit about some things that Homer, the bard, is already assuming about you that you know, and then maybe get into the actual text. I'm also going to assume that you've all done your reading, certainly that you've read at least the books that I've asked you to read, particularly, in particular, books 9 through 12 is where we're going to spend much of our time in the next few days. But a couple things about Homer. Maybe this says something about our culture. I once Googled the word Homer, thinking I'd find some information, and I found a little bit, but most I just found about 500,000 links to Homer Simpson. And that, I think, is exactly where our culture is. Mark wrote, Homer should have developed previously on Walking the Dead style. Absolutely, he should have. He doesn't, because he assumes that you are familiar with the Trojan War. And we'll talk for a moment about why that is. But let me just say a couple things real quick about, my PowerPoint cut off some things there. Let me say a couple things about Homer. I'm romantic. I like to think that there really was a Homer. And if there was a Homer, then he was what we call a traveling bard. A bard, which we sometimes use today as synonymous with a poet, but that's not exactly what it is. A bard is a performing troubadour, if you like. Obviously, the movies, Netflix wasn't readily available in ancient Greece. And so for entertainment, especially about the 8th century, as a matter of fact, they hadn't even developed theater like we think of today. So they didn't have plays to go to. So a bard would come into your town, and that would be a very exciting thing, because he would then perform an epic to you. Now, the word epic, we use that term sometimes today to mean like really bigger than life. If we say a film was epic, We just mean it was like, wow, a big summer blockbuster. Epic literally just means a long narrative poem. And Melody asked if there were melodies that went with the stories. There were, unfortunately, we've lost them. Kind of in the same way that that there were distinct melodies for the Psalms, but we've lost what those melodies are. And but if you've ever heard an example of what we think the ancient Greek music sounded like, it wouldn't be very pretty to our eyes, our ears. But if he existed, he was a traveling bard, probably about the 8th century BC or BCE. So think about the 700s. If you're thinking in terms of the Bible times, this would be about the time when the Assyrians would have taken over the northern tribes of Israel. A tradition imagines him blind. There is absolutely no evidence that he was blind, but that tradition is old, and so it makes one wonder if there isn't something to it. And as many have noted here already, Melody notes that he could have been a committee. That instead of being instead of one man being Homer, that's kind of a name that we use as a kind of personification of a committee of people, or perhaps years of oral tradition. There's a lot of debate as to whether the Homer who wrote the Iliad is the same Homer who wrote the Odyssey. I don't want to get into those debates here. I think that the case could strongly be made that those two Homers are different, but I've heard pretty good arguments in favor of them being the same. But if you ask me, if you had to say, well, what do you think, Mike? I would argue that there really was a Homer. He's not originating these stories. These are not original to him. He's dealing with myths that his audiences would have known, with traditions that they would have known, and there may very well have been somebody who took them and put them into the form that we now have them today. But he didn't originate these stories. He didn't just pull them out of his brain. Now, here's an old sculpture of him actually from about the 3rd or 4th century BC. And you can see he's blind. But a couple other things. But we believe that if he did live, he lived in about the 700s or the 8th century BC. No proof that he existed at all. So it kind of, you had to go on faith on that one. But I will give him this credit, and that is that Plato quotes Socrates, and Socrates certainly believed that Homer existed. And that's only a few centuries away. Not that that's proof, but it just means at least in the 400s, they believed that he was a real person. And I would argue, and I don't think there would be a whole lot of disagreement on this, that the Iliad and the Odyssey, those two epic poems, each one about 40,000 lines of poetry. And if you don't like poetry, here's each one of these poems is 40,000 lines, but they are the definitive epics of the early Western world. In the same way that I would argue that the Bible is the definitive work of our culture, and all literary works after it are essentially planets orbiting around it. I would say that when we think of ancient Europe, when we think of early Western culture, the Iliad and the Odyssey are the sun, and everything else revolves around them. So in that sense, they invented the world that the biblical world will come into. So you could argue that whether or not you've read the Odyssey, this text has read you. Because the world you live in and the person you are is because of these works. Here is an early example of the Iliad. You can see that it's in Greek. I don't speak this kind of Greek, and I don't know if you can even see it very well on your computer. One of the things that's interesting about it is that every single line of the Iliad and the Odyssey is in dactylic hexameter. Now, I don't know if you remember your class in high school where you talked about things like iambic pentameter, but essentially what that means is a hexameter means it's got 6 beats to every line, and dactylic just means it's got the beat of da da. So in other words, every line has 6 beats of da 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 da. I will return when the sun is descended and you are not home. Every single line has that beat. Now, if that sounds like it would get monotonous, well, it's probably because much of it was sung. Also, some have noticed that when you hear it, and I have heard recordings of it, it has the feeling of the sea. It has that kind of da 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 da. So when you hear this poem in its original language, it does have a kind of feeling like you're crossing the sea. It's absolutely, it helps with memorization. And if you're going to memorize a 40,000 line poem, having a regular rhythm is going to help. And my guess is that that may actually be the dominant reason why, because poetry with rhythm and poetry that is sung is easier to memorize. And that would be a long piece. It's in 24 books, as I said on last Wednesday. It's very possible it's performed on 24 performances. Just a couple more things. This just kind of reiterates what I've said, that the Iliad and the Odyssey are in dactylic hexameters. If you want to impress your friends, just use those words. Those, especially guys, want to impress, the chicks. Chicks dig a man who can speak in multisyllabic words. So just say dactylic hexameter over and over again. And now I would like to talk a little bit about this epic, this mythology that we're entering. Homer assumes some things. He assumes some very distinctive things that we know. In the same way as I argued that the death and resurrection of Jesus is the central myth of Christianity, and the Passover is the central myth of Judaism. And just as I argue, and I don't know if you agree with this, that I would argue that the Civil War was the central mythology of the United States, and every culture has its one dominant myth, if you will, the star that the culture revolves around. The Greeks and the Romans, who essentially share the same mythology, because the Romans, who are creative in so many ways, but just simply stole the Greek mythology and gave it new names. But the central myth of the Greek world and the Roman world, the absolute two most important early empires and traditions of the early Western world. I maybe would add, I might add Egypt in there as well. But even more dominant would be the Greeks and the Romans. That their central myth is the Trojan War. That mythology absolutely is the most important thing to know when you are coming to anything that deals with Greek mythology or Roman mythology, because they're the same. And the war begins because of a woman. And maybe I'll just share the story because I just find it delightful. I find Greek stories absolutely delightful. Not only does it start with a woman, it starts with a woman and an apple. So if that doesn't sound a little bit like our mythology, so I wrote here that, alas, women and apples shouldn't mix. So excuse my little sexist humor. But the way it worked here is that the gods of Olympus decided to have a party. And so there on the top of the highest mountain in Greece, which is Mount Olympus, And if you see it, it doesn't seem like a very high mountain, but the first time anyone ever scaled it wasn't until the 19th century. But they believe at the top of that mountain, that's where the Olympian gods live. So Zeus hosts this big party, and he invites every god to this party. Every god except for Eris, the goddess of strife. Now, do you blame him, really? Because, if you're going to have a party, the one thing you don't want is to invite the goddess of strife. So he doesn't. So Eris, she's really ticked off that she's not invited. So she comes up with this great plan. She takes a golden apple and she inscribes onto the golden apple the words Callisti, which essentially means for the most beautiful one, or for the fairest one. And then she tosses it into the middle of the party. So here rolls this golden apple into the middle of the party, and suddenly it starts a big fight where you have all the goddesses arguing over who this is meant for. Because it says it's for the most beautiful one. And so you begin to have an argument. And you have an argument especially between the three, I would argue, the three most powerful goddesses of the Olympians. Hera, she's the wife of Zeus, also the older sister of Zeus, the goddess of the hearth and home, the goddess of marriage. She's always angry with her husband because her husband can't seem to keep, his zipper zipped. There's Athena, the daughter of Zeus. Athena is the goddess of wisdom, also sometimes the goddess of poetry and reason. Her beginning is rather interesting because Zeus was having a little affair, as he seemed to do regularly, with, and I can't remember what her mother's name was, but probably someone could Google that. And an oracle comes, and the oracle tells Zeus that the daughter of her and of this goddess and him, that they've just, as a result of their little get together, that this goddess that's inside of her will rival even him in strength and in wisdom. Well, Zeus is really worried about that. He can't have another goddess who's equal to him in all of those things. And so he does the rational thing. He devours the mother, eats her whole. And of course, she's a goddess, so she's still alive in there and bears the child to full term. And one day, Zeus feels a terrible headache. I think about this every time I have a headache. Just an excruciating headache. He has someone strike him on the head to split his head open, and out pops Athena, fully grown, fully clothed, in full battle armor. I love that story. And that's why you'll always see her. She's always in armor. But yes, she is equal to Zeus in intelligence and in strength and in power. However, she is absolutely devoted to her father. So she remains a virgin. She's always the virgin goddess. So unlike most of them, she seems to be able to actually control herself. So Hera, Athena, and then Aphrodite, the goddess of love. And they each claim the apple. They each say, "This is mine." And so they start to have an argument. Zeus doesn't want any part of this. So he, says, you guys decide. I don't want to be a part of this argument. And so the three goddesses decide the best way to solve this is let's have a beauty contest. And so they appoint a human, a mortal, the son of the king of Troy, the younger son, Paris. And so they show up, and here's a wonderful image, wonderful picture of this beauty contest. I don't know why they're naked, but apparently especially when Renaissance painters depict them, they're always naked. Any chance they could get to paint naked women, they seem to grab it. And they each pass before him. But of course, they each want to hedge their bet, so they bribe Paris. And so the first goddess that comes before him is Hera. And Hera is certainly the most powerful. She's the queen of the gods, daughter, a wife of Zeus. And so she promises Paris that if he will pick her, that she will grant him power, that he will have great power. And then Athena passes before Paris. And she being the goddess of wisdom says, if you pick me, then I will give you great wisdom. And then Aphrodite, being the goddess of love, passes before him. And she says, if you pick me, I'll give you the most beautiful woman in the world. Well, Paris is a typical man, and so you can guess which one he picks. He picks the most beautiful woman in the world. Sorry. And unfortunately, though, the most beautiful woman in the world is Helen of Sparta, who's already married to Menelaus. And in some of the stories, Helen leaves on her own accord and goes with Paris, and they run and have a little affair. In some stories, Aphrodite's child, Eros, also known as Cupid in the Romans, that shoots her with an arrow, and she just falls desperately in love with Paris, and they run off to Troy. But the most important thing is that Aphrodite wins, and now Helen has run away from her husband and has gone to Troy. Well, Menelaus is ticked off, and so he does the typical male thing, and he decides, I'm going to go to war with Paris's hometown, and I'm going to kill them all. And he enlists his friend Agamemnon, who's the king of Athens, and about 1,000 other kings, and they all go to war with Troy. All because Troy has Menelaus's wife there. And that becomes an epic 10-year war where some of the greatest heroes will die. And of course, it's not just the heroes that are fighting, but the goddesses themselves are fighting, because Aphrodite wants, she already sided with Paris, and so she's fighting for the Trojans. But Athena and Hera, well, they're ticked off that they didn't get picked, so they're fighting with the Greeks. And that's how the Trojan War begins. Here's a map, actually. I don't know if you can see it very well on here. I see my cursor on there, but you can kind of see the region that we're talking about. We have Sparta. This is where Helen is from, and her husband Menelaus. You have Athens, which is the most powerful city by far. That's where Agamemnon is. And then you have all these little city-states and all these little islands, one of which, of course, is Ithaca. And that's the one that Odysseus is the king of. And they all come together, and they all land over here. You see my little cursor there. They're going to land here, and they're going to fight Troy. It's actually like in modern day Turkey today. And so tons of people die. As a matter of fact, almost all of the Trojans will end up dying. And nobody will end up being happy as a result of this. So wonderful story. It's difficult to know how serious the Greeks take this story, whether they see it as true or whether they just see this as a myth. But it is important to note that it is crucial to the thinking. The Romans will read this entirely differently because they will view the Trojans, who will lose this war, as their ancestors. So when the Greeks finally win, thanks to the intelligence and cleverness of Odysseus, where they figure, let's just make a horse and we'll make it look like we have given up and we're giving them this gift. We'll stuff it full of soldiers. They'll bring it in the city. They'll get drunk. They'll open up the door. We'll burn the city down. We'll throw the babies off the wall. We'll take the women as slaves, and we'll kill all the men. Which is pretty much what happened. So nobody really lives happily ever after, actually, because the Greeks will go back and run into their own troubles. Agamemnon will get killed by his wife because Agamemnon, in order to get the god's blessing, killed his daughter. So he comes back 10 years later, and his wife, Clytemnestra, kills him. And nobody lives happy. Probably the only one that ends up living happily ever after is they take Helen back to Menelaus, and they actually seem happy when you meet them in the Odyssey. That's probably the only ones who ever lived happily ever after. But otherwise, I don't know that anyone lives happily ever after. But the Romans will use this war as an excuse for sacking the Greeks, because since they believed that they were they're the descendants of the Trojans, well, then the Greeks had it coming. The Romans were not the descendants of the Trojans, but that will be the story that will be invented, that they will believe, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Was there ever a Troy? Well, actually, this is a wonderful story. There was an amateur archaeologist who was just determined to find it, and sure enough, he found an actual Troy, right where it should have been. Actually, it's about 50 miles in from the water, because the water has receded a great deal since that war. And not only did they find out that Troy had been destroyed, but actually they did a bunch of archaeological digs and discovered that Troy had been destroyed 12 times. So I would think after the second or third time, they would think, oh, let's quit now. But no, it was built and destroyed 12 times. So what can you say? Oh, no quiz. Sorry, I was kidding. No quiz. Anyway, what's crucial to that is that Homer assumes that you know all of this. And so this terrible war has already taken place. And then we begin to have Odysseus trying to get home. And we have what I think is a wonderful story. I'm just kind of curious. Normally I would ask my students, what did you think of what you read? Did you like what you read? Just give you a chance to type in any comments that you had. What did you think of what you read? Well, good. Marianne read and thought it was interesting. Mark liked, and it's true, Mark, that the opening is really about his son and how his son essentially is called on by Athena to go help find his father. That's right. That's right, Brandon. Good. Marianne said it wasn't too hard, and Allie found it interesting. That makes me happy. And Megan says that Odysseus can be very frustrating, and I agree. And I would like to talk a little bit about that. Kind of take a moment here to know. One of the things that we discover from Odysseus as we read, one of the qualities of epics. Okay, this you'll find in every single epic, whether it's the Iliad, which is just the story of the Trojan War, but it's not the entire 10 years of the Trojan War. It's only going to give us 6 months of the Trojan War, because epics rarely begin at the beginning of the story. Rarely starts at the beginning. It's usually begins in what we say in Latin, "in medias res," or in the middle of the action, if you will. So it's imagine, as a lot of movies do, you start the movie and the movie actually begins somewhere in the middle of the action, and then you find out much of what's happened before through flashbacks, through things that is typical of almost every epic. And the Odyssey begins not at the beginning, because if we were writing that today, we might begin right where that made-for-TV film does, which is right at the end of the war. But instead, it begins about 9 years after Odysseus has been trying to get home. just as the Iliad begins about 9 years after the war's been going. We don't even get the end of the war in the Iliad, although we do get the end where Odysseus will finally get home. Oh, I'm so glad Kevin mentioned that "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou" is a kind of fun American retelling of "Oh Brother, Where" of the Odyssey, where you have all the same characters done in kind of that late or early 20th century South, and it's wonderful. It's got a Cyclops. We have the one-eyed monster, but in "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou," he's a one-eyed lawyer, which is kind of like a one-eyed monster. And you have sirens who are calling people, and of course there it's very different. That it's where you have these women leading them into the water. You have it's wonderful. It's wonderful. I'm gonna recommend, after we've spent some time with the Odyssey, that you watch "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou," and I think that would be that could be a great paper. If you're still looking for a paper idea, because the Odyssey and the "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou" are so close that it's fun to see that how the American mythology kind of gets put in there. So that's well worth it. We don't actually run into Odysseus though until quite a few books later. It begins really with Telemachus, who is Odysseus' son. Now Telemachus was just a baby when Odysseus goes to fight the war. Now here he is. He's about 19 years old. He's a man, and the goddess Athena, though he doesn't realize that's who it is, or at least others don't realize who it is calling him on an adventure. Now remember, we talked about the monument, the hero's journey. And in this case, it begins as if the hero is going to be Telemachus. And he's called to adventure by Athena. You could argue in many ways that we have a number of hero's journeys taking place in the Odyssey. We have Telemachus. We also have, of course, Odysseus. And it's also interesting to think of Penelope, who is perhaps the most beautiful whole thing. This does sound a great deal like The Hobbit, and that's because Tolkien was very much in love with epic poetry. He was more interested in the Norse myths, so he's looking more at the sagas of the Icelanders, what we think of as Viking myths, but I find Odysseus, though he does frustrate me too, that he is, but he's also a very sympathetic person. I'm going to jump right ahead, and I'm going to, if you have a copy of the text, then I would love for you to open up your book, especially if you have the Robert Fagles one, because I'm going to go right ahead to something that's where we just jump into one of his adventures. It's so hard, and there's a little amount of time really to know where to begin. But if you have a copy of the book, pull it out, or you can just look on your screen, because I actually have here a kind of photocopy, if you will, PDF of the book, and I'm going to jump to page 222. One of the earliest places after the war, and we're in the book Odyssey, is he ends up on the island of the Cyclops. And this is a wonderful story, and I normally would have somebody read it aloud, but it'll have to be me. So if you are looking here, you can see I've got a little cursor here. I'm going to start right here. So you have, well, actually, I'm going to start at the top here, and I'm going to read a pretty long passage here. And I want you to notice the writing style and how different it is. We're in book 9 of the Odyssey. In my text, it would be about line 375. And so if any of you have a different translation, it's essentially they've come into the Cyclops' cave, and he's not a very good host, which we will talk about here in a moment. And so he begins to slowly eat them. He'll have a couple for breakfast, have a couple for dinner, and they need to do something. Odysseus, some are all dead because he's going to eat them all. And so beginning right there, about line 375, it says, nightfall brought him back, herding his woolly sheep. And he quickly drove the sleek flock into the vaulted cavern, rams and all, none left outside in the walled yard. His own idea, perhaps, or a god led him on. Then he holstered the huge slab to block the door and squatted to milk his sheep and bleating goats. And as soon as he had briskly finished all his chores, he snatched up 2 more men and fixed his meal. But this time I lifted a carved wooden bowl. And here's Odysseus talking. He's telling this story. A brimful of my ruddy wine, and went right up to the Cyclops, enticing. Here, Cyclops, try this wine. To top off the banquet of human flesh you bolted down. Judge for yourself what stock our ship had stored. I brought it here to make you a fine libation, hoping you would pity me, Cyclops, send me home, but your rages are insufferable. You barbarian, how can any man on earth come visit you after this? What have you done? What you've done outrages all that is right. What's Odysseus saying here? This is crucial. And I really want to make this point. And I'm going to make this point again on Wednesday. Super point. I'm going to come back here so you can see me here. All right. In the Near and Middle Eastern world, in the biblical world, in the Greek world, in the Roman world, even in much of the African world, the highest, most important virtue is a thing called xenia. 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 There's no real good translation for xenia in English. The best we could do is the word hospitality. Now, I don't really like that word as a translation, because when I think hospitality, I think inviting people over for potluck after church. It's more than that. In the ancient world, they didn't have motels, and you weren't able to travel very well without the help of others and the generosity of others. So if I were to come to your house and I were to come with a gift, let's say I brought a sheep, and I said, may I stay in your house? You are obligated. It's not just like you should. You are obligated to take me in, to take care of me. And I know that sounds like kind of like, oh my goodness, really? But yeah, no, you're obligated to take me in and feed me, make sure I have a place to stay until I'm ready to leave. Okay? This is true in the Bible. This is true in the Greeks. This is true in the Romans. The way we can tell who is good and who is bad in the Old Testament and in the Greek myths, exactly the same. The way we tell is, do they display xenia? Are they hospitable to guests? I'm going to give you a good example that's in the Bible. It's a story that bothers me, and that is the story of Lot. I don't know how many of you have read that story much, where Lot, who lives in Sodom, okay, Lot is there, and some guests come. Actually, they had previously been guests of Abraham. He doesn't know that. And Abraham, of course, took them in, fed them the best of his food, encouraged them to keep staying, took care of them. That's how we know Abraham is good. As a matter of fact, those guests who turn out to be angels even say, because of this, we know that he is good. So they've come into Sodom. They're going to stay in the town square, which of course is not a good idea in this town. And Lot says, oh, no, 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 come to my house. Come stay at my house. Already we know Lot is a good man because he's displaying Zania. He's saying, come stay in my house. They finally agree after much persuasion. And then the story takes a dark turn. And so that night, while he's taking care of his guests, as he should, showing Zania, there's a knock on the door. And Genesis tells us that all the men and the boys are there. And they say, send us out those men you have as guests so we can have sex with them. Now, Lot comes out and does something that has always bothered me. I hope it bothers you. He steps out on the porch and he says, gentlemen, don't do this evil thing who live in my house. Who are staying in my house. Okay, they're guests in my house. Instead, take my virgin daughters. You can have them. Now, Zania is not the highest virtue in our culture. As a matter of fact, I would argue in our culture, the highest virtue is actually family. Family is the highest virtue, because family, you'll often have people who say, I can say bad things about my family, but don't you do it. People will stick up for their family no matter what. So this makes no sense to us. You would think, like, more than anything, he would defend his daughters. But this is a different world and a different paradigm. But the most important thing is his guests. I know this is hard to believe, but we're actually supposed to view Lot somewhat sympathetically. Because what Lot's saying is, I would rather my own virgin daughters be taken than guests in my house and treated badly. Now, Lot's daughters will get revenge. They'll have sex with their dad later on. We don't want to go into that part of the story. They didn't tell me that when I was in primary. But you get the idea. This is called Zania. This is what Odysseus is saying. He's saying, we brought you wine. We brought you gifts. And the idea is hoping that you would take care of us. And thank you, Mark, because Odysseus' son shows a great example of this. Line 81 of page 140. Yes, when he's visiting, he does this over and over again, actually. When he visits Menelaus, when he visits the different places, he brings a gift. And then they show Zania in return. That's how we know Telemachus is good. That's how we know Menelaus is good. Penelope is dealing with a problem where she has shown Zania and her guests won't leave. And they're taking advantage of her. This is how we know Penelope is really good and her guests are monstrous because they're taking advantage of Zania. So Odysseus is saying, you are the worst of the worst. You are super evil. The thing that makes you evil isn't just that you're eating us, but you're treating us, who are your guests, very poorly. You're eating us. Anyway, so jumping here again to the text, and I'm going to go back to it here, line about 395. Going here, right about here, we can see it on the second, the left-hand column. At that he, the Cyclops, seized the bowl and tossed it off, and the heady wine pleased him immensely. More, he demanded, a second bowl, a hearty helping. And tell me your name now, quickly, so I can hand my guest a gift to warm his heart. In other words, all right, tell me your name and I'll show you Zania. I'll give you a gift in return. And this is wonderful. And you can hear the oral quality. This is poetry that's meant to be heard, not read. And our soil yields the Cyclops powerful, full-bodied wine, and the rains from Zeus build its strength. But this, in other words, this wine, is nectar and ambrosia. This flows from heaven. So he declared. And I poured him another fiery bowl. 3 bowls I brimmed, and 3 he drank the last drop of full. And then when the wine was swirling around his brain, I approached my host with a cordial, winning word. So, you ask me the name I'm known by, Cyclops. I will tell you. But you must give me a guest gift. In other words, you must show me Xenia, as you promised. Nobody. That's my name, nobody. So my mother and father call me all my friends. And then the Cyclops says, but he boomed back at me with his ruthless heart. Nobody? Well, I'll eat nobody last of all his friends. I'll eat the others first. That's my gift to you. So it's funny. Here we see an example of what we seem to see over and over and over again of Odysseus's cleverness. He's clever. He realizes, I'm not going to tell him his name. So he tells him his name is nobody. The Cyclops, who is not very bright, takes him at his word and says, all right, my gift to you, my Xenia to you is I'll just eat you last, which of course we know that means the Cyclops is bad. So Odysseus comes up with a very clever idea to make a big giant steak out of the log there, and now here's something I want you to notice. Erich Auerbach, the great literary critic, who argued that Genesis is the greatest literary work until Shakespeare. Remember, he argued that what makes it so great is that it's got the gaps, that it gives us the sparest details. Well, Homer is the opposite of that. He's going to give us detail upon detail upon detail. He's going to tell us what's going to happen. He will tell us what happens, and then he will tell us what happened. And he will tell us in metaphor after metaphor. So here we go. Continuing on, he says, with that, he toppled over, sprawled full length, flat on his back, and lay there, his massive neck slumping to one side. And sleep that conquers all overwhelmed him now as wine came spurting, flooding up from his gullet with chunks of human flesh. He vomited blind drunk. So the Bible had just said he slept, he fell asleep. Here we get, he's drunk, he's vomiting up humans. Now at last I thrust our steak in a bed of embers to get it red hot and rallied all my comrades. Courage, no panic, no one hang back now. And green as it was, just as the olive steak was about to catch fire, the glow terrific, yes, I dragged it from the flames, my men clustering round as some god breathed enormous courage through us all. Hoisting high that olive stake with its stabbing point, straight into the monster's eye they rammed it hard. I drove my weight on it from above and bored it home as a shipwright bores his beam with shipwright's drill, that men below, whipping the strap back and forth, whirl, and the drill keeps twisting faster, never stopping. See, Genesis would have said, and we thrust the stake into his eye. But no, we're getting details of what it looked like and sounded like. And it doesn't end there. So we seized our stake with its fiery tip and bored it round and round in the giant's eye, till blood came boiling up around that smoking shaft, and the hot blast singed his brow and eyelids round the core, and the broiling eyeball burst. Its crackling roots blazed and hissed. You think he's done? No. He's not done yet. As a blacksmith plunges a glowing axe or adds in an ice-cold bath, and the metal screeches steam and its temper hardens. That's the iron strength. So the eye of the Cyclops sizzled round that stake. So we're just getting the popping and the sizzling sound. And so, sorry, I'm starting to get too much into it. I just get so excited. So you get the idea. It's the opposite of Genesis, where we almost get detail upon detail upon detail upon detail. It's just full of detail, and there are no gaps. And it would be a wonderful, if you're also looking for a paper, this is a wonderful thing where you compare the sparseness of the narrative of Genesis with the almost too much from Homer, where we get almost too many details, where you almost start to laugh out loud at the details here, describing the steak and the boiling eyeball and the crackling and so on and so forth. Delightful. Now, of course, they get away, and I'll let you read how that happens. They're sailing away, and then Odysseus does something that's not clever, where he yells from the boat that it was Odysseus that was too clever for him. But since the Cyclops can't see anything, and so he can't do anything to reach him. But now that he can hear Odysseus yelling, he's got his voice and he can throw big boulders, and he almost kills them. So we get plenty of evidence of Odysseus's cleverness. But is he wise? Is he a wise man? Now remember, this is very early into his journey home. But it was another wonderful idea, and I plan to make this as one of my questions on Google Classroom. But we see lots of evidence of his cleverness. But is there evidence that he grows in wisdom as the story goes on? And remembering that the story is not chronological. We're hearing through flashbacks, so you have to kind of piece together the story in your mind. But is the Odysseus that finally comes out of perhaps Hades, the Odysseus that will ultimately get home? I haven't asked you to read that far. But is he a wiser man? Is he a wiser man than the man who went to war? And to be honest, there's no right or wrong answer on that. People have been arguing that for a long time. Our time has gone very fast, and I really want to spend a little bit of time on Wednesday talking about Odysseus and Xenia. I want to get back a little to the Xenia. I also want to talk about the fact that Odysseus seems to boink every goddess he runs into. That's a literary term. He seems to boink all the goddesses. Granted, it does seem that they are enticing him, and he doesn't have a whole lot of choice. But meanwhile, back at home, Penelope, his wife, is surrounded by all these suitors, these men who would love to have him. And I know, I'm not blaming the woman, but she is faithful. She is chaste. Yeah, this is something I find interesting. Have you ever noticed there's such a difference between men and women in this issue? For example, the guy can play around, and he's a player. But if Penelope had played around, well, she's a slut. True. I mean, you got to admit, isn't there? This is a double standard that Homer is aware of clearly, and it's a double standard that's still with us today. I remember I had a student once say, "Well, that's why the girls' dorms are stricter than the boys' dorms, because the guys, they're just walking penises." And I've also heard that the women can get pregnant, but I'm thinking, well, it's the men who are doing the impregnating, so it should be the guys' dorm that's strict. Make them have like an 8 o'clock curfew, and let the women go have fun. I like this melody. It says, no, I think it was more the girls' dorm is a castle to be guarded. Yes, guarded from the men. And Megan, thank you for mentioning that. I imagine how that would be different in the telling of the myths. Absolutely, that's a wonderful thought. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well, as he runs into Circe, as he runs into Calypso and some other goddesses, and what's going on with Penelope. Let me just say one last thing, and the on Xenia. And just give me like 2 minutes to get preachy all of a sudden. I realize that Xenia is not the dominant virtue of our culture. But it is interesting that Jesus, when Jesus talked about judgment, Jesus almost never talked about judgment. But when he did, he did it in a very poignant way. And really one of the very few moments is in the story of the sheep and the goats. This is one of the few times, this and the story, the dip your finger in the water parable. Was it Lazarus and the rich man? But the parable of the sheep and the goats, you have the sheep and the goats, and you have essentially Jesus, and he's got one side saying, come in, I've got this place prepared for you. Because notice what it is that he says are the reasons why. It's, when I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was in prison, you visited me. When I was naked, you gave me clothes. In other words, you showed Xenia. You were generous. And when you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. Then you have the goats, where he's like, get out of here. I don't know you. You didn't take care of me. You didn't when I was naked and when I was hungry and when I needed a place to stay. You did none of those things. And so notice that the one time that Jesus actually articulates judgment, he uses Xenia, saying that's often in the same way, perhaps, that you can see who the good people are in the Genesis stories, the Greek stories, is through Xenia. That's obviously a pretty big deal in the New Testament too. This isn't arguing that that's your means to salvation, but there is something about people with a relationship with God that Xenia becomes a part of it. So pardon me if I get a little preachy there. I'm going to go ahead and end there, and I'm hoping that you get to work on your papers. I want to encourage those of you who have not had a chance to answer some of the lecture questions that I have. Those are questions you just get points for just doing. You don't get it right or wrong. And I've already put 2 up. I'm going to go ahead and encourage you to try to get those done. And because I'm going to put up another one based on today's lecture. I'll put that up probably first thing in the morning. I have almost no internet at home right now. I realize now how addicted to it I am. Anyway, yes, so I'd like you to read books 9 through 12 for sure. We're going to spend the entire class, the live session on Wednesday in those. We'll talk a little bit about Hades, going into the underworld, and how big that is in mythology of going to the underworld. And here's some questions I want to answer real quick. So Kevin asked, so what's the status for coming to your wife's office for live lectures? You know what? If you want, at any point, if you're like, man, I'd rather just come watch you live, you could come in, just watch me talk to my computer. That could work. Or you can even stop by and ask questions and be there early. I could talk, if some of you would prefer that, I could actually possibly arrange a way where you can, we could do the class and you just have a full classroom experience. And then those who don't want to do it, that way I can still have the online. I could do some of that as well. But I'm usually right here I'll be here again on Wednesday if you want to pop in. It's the second floor. I don't know what her number is, but there aren't that many classrooms on second floor Dick Building. So you just pop in, and that can be helpful to some of you, especially if you have questions about a paper or something like that. And I hope you have a great evening. But I encourage you just to go through the whole streaming of the Google Classroom. I'll stick on for another extra 5 minutes here. If anyone has some questions here, just real quick, I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. So here's a lecture question I asked. 11 of you have done it. 9 of you have not done it yet. So I encourage you they're just thought questions based on what we talked about in class. Also going down here, I can see that the first one that I did, only 13 of you have done it. So I encourage you, if you've not done those, just go in. All you do is click on it, and you'll go right into it, and you can do it in the comments section. Okay? That's all you have to do. All right, I'll stay on for an extra 5 minutes. Otherwise, I hope you have a great evening, and I will talk to you on Wednesday. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to get back to me, and here I'm messing this up altogether here. There we are. Otherwise, I'm making myself dizzy. So have a great one, and